The room was prepared for laughter before anything else. Whenever Muhammad Ali entered a space, words usually followed him like sparks. People expected rhythm, jokes, confidence, and charm delivered without effort. Silence was never part of the script when Ali was near. His presence alone normally filled every corner of the room. That expectation made the moment feel strange almost immediately. A question had been asked, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough to reach him. Faces turned instinctively, waiting for the familiar smile or quick reply. Ali's posture didn't change, but the energy in the room did. Something unseen had shifted. He didn't laugh it off. He didn't raise his eyebrows or lean forward. Instead, he stayed still, eyes focused somewhere beyond the people watching him. At first, it felt like a pause, one of those dramatic beats he sometimes used, but the pause stretched longer than anyone expected. Seconds passed, and the room began to feel heavier. People shifted in their seats, unsure whether to react or wait. The confidence they associated with Ali suddenly felt distant. It wasn't gone, but it wasn't on display either. The silence pressed against everyone present. Ali had always been defined by motion. He moved with his feet, with his hands, with his voice. Stillness had never been part of his public image. Yet here it was, unavoidable and unbroken. The absence of sound made the moment impossible to ignore. Some thought he hadn't heard the question clearly. Others assumed he was choosing his words carefully, preparing something clever. But as the silence continued, it became clear this wasn't performance. This was something deeper, something unplanned. The room had gone from anticipation to discomfort. People began to realize they were witnessing something rare. Ali wasn't controlling the moment was controlling him. And that reversal alone felt unsettling. His face showed no anger, no amusement, no defiance. It was calm, almost distant, as if he had stepped away from the room without moving his body. That expression confused those who thought they knew him best. This was not the Ali they expected. The longer he stayed silent, the more powerful the silence became. It demanded attention without asking for it. No one dared interrupt. The respect he commanded ensured that even confusion turned into patience. Ali's silence carried weight because it contrasted so sharply with his legend. He was known as a master of words, someone who used language like a weapon and a shield. To see him set both aside felt unnatural, almost alarming. People later struggled to describe what those moments felt like. Some said it was uncomfortable. Others said it was humbling. A few described it as witnessing a man listening to something no one else could hear. Whatever it was, it left an impression. The question itself wasn't loud or aggressive. That made the silence even more confusing. It didn't demand confrontation, yet it produced one internally. Ali wasn't fighting a person in that moment. He was confronting something far less visible. Time slowed in a way only silence can cause. Each second felt longer than the last. The room had become a space of waiting, not for an answer, but for permission to breathe again. Ali still hadn't moved. His hands rested calmly, betraying none of the tension people felt around him. The champion who once danced across rings now remained motionless. That contrast carried its own kind of drama, quieter but more intense. This was not the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of recognition. Something had landed inside him with enough force to stop everything else. No crowd noise, no expectation, no habit could push it aside. Those who had come expecting entertainment realized they were witnessing vulnerability instead. Ali was no longer performing for them. He had turned inward and the room had no choice but to follow his lead. There was a sense that interrupting the moment would be disrespectful. Even those closest to him understood this silence mattered. It wasn't empty space. It was occupied by thought, memory, and realization. The absence of sound amplified every detail. The scrape of a chair felt loud. A breath felt noticeable. The silence made everyone aware of themselves in a way Ali usually distracted them from. Ali had spent a lifetime being louder than life. Now life itself had quieted him. That reversal carried a gravity no speech could match. It hinted that something meaningful was unfolding beneath the surface. People later said they remembered exactly where they were when it happened. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. The silence carved itself into memory. In those moments, Ali wasn't the entertainer, the provocateur, or the symbol. He was simply a man sitting with a truth he hadn't expected to face. That made the silence honest, unfiltered, and unforgettable. When the room finally exhaled, it was clear something had changed. The silence had rewritten the moment before any words ever could, and everyone present sensed that they had just witnessed a side of Muhammad Ali few ever saw. The question did not arrive with aggression or challenge. It was spoken calmly, almost casually, the kind of question that usually invites a quick reply. On the surface it seemed harmless, even ordinary, but something about it slipped past the defenses. Muhammad Ali had built over a lifetime. It didn't collide with his confidence. It bypassed it entirely. Ali had faced insults far sharper than this. He had stood across from men who wanted to hurt him, humiliate him, or silence him. Those moments never stopped his voice. He always knew how to respond, how to turn pressure into performance. This time there was nothing to perform. The question reached a place that fists never could. It didn't ask about strength, speed, or courage. It asked something quieter, something that didn't belong to the ring. And because it wasn't framed as a challenge, Ali couldn't fight it the way he was used to fighting everything else. For years, Ali's words had been his armor. If someone questioned him, he out-talked them. If someone doubted him, he laughed it off. His language was sharp, fast, and protective. But this question didn't leave room for poetry or bravado. It required honesty. What made it powerful was its simplicity. There was no insult to deflect, no opponent to size up. It didn't demand a defense. It invited reflection, and reflection was something Ali had rarely allowed himself in public. Movement had always felt safer than stillness. The question forced him to look inward instead of outward. For a man who had spent most of his life projecting strength, that shift was disorienting. It asked him to consider something beyond victories and defeats, something that could not be measured or announced. Ali had built his identity on certainty. He knew who he was in the ring, in front of cameras in the public eye. But the question unsettled that certainty. It didn't attack his past. It quietly questioned his present. And that was harder to face. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that not every moment could be answered with confidence. Some moments demanded acknowledgement instead. The question wasn't asking him to prove anything. It was asking him to recognize something already true. That recognition came slowly. At first there was resistance, an instinctive urge to respond, to reclaim control of the room. But the longer he sat with it, the clearer it became that words would only dilute what he was feeling. Silence was the only honest response. The question had found a crack in the legend. Not a weakness, but a human opening. It reminded him that even the most celebrated lives are shaped by time. That realization carried a weight he couldn't ignore or rush past. Ali had spent decades outrunning doubt. He danced away from it, talked over it, punched through it. But this question didn't chase him. It waited. And in waiting, it forced him to slow down in ways he never had before. What unsettled him most was not the content of the question, but what it revealed. It exposed how much of his life had been lived in motion, how rarely he had paused long enough to listen to himself without an audience. The question stripped away context. No titles mattered. No history mattered. It reduced everything to a single moment of awareness. And in that moment, Ali understood he couldn't rely on habit or reputation to guide him. There was no immediate fear, no panic. Instead, there was clarity arriving in layers. Each second of silence peeled something back. Each breath made the realization harder to ignore and easier to accept. He understood that the question wasn't about the past. It was about continuity, about what remains when applause fades and the body slows. It asked him to consider his place not as a champion, but as a man moving forward in time. That was not a conversation Ali had often allowed himself. The future had always felt abstract, distant, something to be handled later. Now it felt present, sitting quietly with him in the room. The question reframed strength in a way that unsettled him. Strength was no longer about asserting dominance or control. It was about acknowledging limits without shame. That shift challenged everything he had built his public identity around. Ali realized that silence wasn't avoidance in this moment. It was respect for the question and for himself. Speaking too quickly would have meant escaping the truth instead of facing it, and he was no longer willing to escape. The people watching could sense something unfolding, even if they didn't understand it. They saw a man who had mastered every external battle pause for an internal one. That pause carried more meaning than any speech. The question had done its work without force. It didn't demand a transformation, but it made one possible. It invited Ali into a space he had rarely occupied, a space where listening mattered more than responding. By the time he was fully aware of what the question had touched, he knew there was no simple answer. Some realizations aren't meant to be explained. They are meant to be lived with, and that understanding marked the beginning of something new. Those 10 minutes unfolded quietly, but inside Muhammad Ali they were anything but empty. His mind did not drift. It moved deliberately, almost carefully. Through years he rarely revisited in one place. The stillness around him allowed memories to surface without interruption. There was no crowd noise to drown them out, no rhythm to distract him. For the first time in a long while, he was alone with himself. Images arrived without order. Bright lights over packed arenas, blended with smaller, quieter moments no one else remembered. He saw himself young, fearless, convinced the world would always move at his pace. That version of him felt both familiar and distant, like a photograph fading at the edges. The contrast between then and now pressed gently but firmly against him. He remembered the speed first, how light his body once felt, how movement came without thought. Back then, his legs answered before his mind finished asking. That ease had defined him, and losing it had been gradual enough to ignore. Now, sitting still, he could no longer pretend it hadn't changed. Then came the voices. Reporters, opponents, admirers, critics. All of them layered over each other. Years of questions and declarations echoing at once. He had always known how to respond to those voices. Silence had never been part of that exchange, until now. He thought about the fights people celebrated and the ones they forgot. Victories that felt inevitable in hindsight. Losses that taught him more than applause ever did. Each bout had taken something from him, even the ones he won. At the time, the cost felt worth it. In reflection, it felt heavier. There were moments of pride he still carried without hesitation, standing firm when it mattered, speaking out when silence would have been easier. Those decisions shaped him as much as any championship. Yet even pride carried complexity when viewed through the lens of time. Regret appeared next, quieter but persistent. Not about punches thrown, but about words spoken too sharply, jokes that cut deeper than intended. Moments when confidence crossed into cruelty. He had moved past those moments quickly when they happened. Now they asked to be acknowledged. He realized how often he had used motion to avoid stillness. Training, traveling, speaking, there was always something next. Movement kept questions at a distance. Sitting in silence removed that distance entirely. The body demanded attention too. Subtle discomfort reminded him that time leaves its mark whether one notices or not. Strength no longer arrived on command. Energy required negotiation. These changes hadn't come suddenly, but recognizing them all at once felt significant. He understood that his identity had long been tied to resistance. Resistance to doubt, to expectation, to limitation. That resistance had served him well, but it had also prevented him from accepting certain truths when they first appeared. Acceptance felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. The silence allowed him to see how often he had measured himself by reaction, by how people responded to him, by the space he occupied when he spoke. In that quiet room there was no reaction to feed on, only presence. He thought about legacy, though not in grand terms, not statues or speeches. He wondered what moments would remain when stories were retold without his voice guiding them. What qualities would surface when strength was no longer the focus? For the first time he saw that greatness didn't require constant proof. It could exist without demonstration. That realization softened something in him. It allowed him to rest, if only briefly, from the effort of being exceptional. He noticed how different this felt from fear. Fear had urgency. This did not. This was steady, almost calm. The awareness arrived without panic, inviting understanding instead of resistance. There was clarity in recognizing that time was not an opponent. It was not something to be defeated or outpaced. It moved forward regardless of effort. Fighting it only created exhaustion. Meeting it honestly offered something else. He recognized that silence had given him access to truths noise never allowed. Noise had always rewarded performance. Silence rewarded attention. That distinction mattered more than he had ever realized. The room around him remained unchanged, yet he felt different within it, not transformed, but adjusted, as if something had aligned quietly into place. The realization did not demand action. It asked for awareness. He understood why the silence could not be rushed. Words would have ended the process too soon. Speaking would have pulled him back into habit. Staying quiet allowed the moment to complete itself. Those 10 minutes were not about answers. They were about perspective, about seeing his life not as a series of victories, but as a continuum shaped by choices, consequences, and time. He felt no urge to explain what he was thinking. Some understandings lose their power when spoken aloud. This one felt personal, meant to be carried rather than shared. As the silence continued, it no longer felt heavy, it felt necessary. It had given him space he didn't know he needed, space to acknowledge change without judgment. When the moment finally passed, he knew it would stay with him, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. Those 10 minutes inside his own mind had quietly shifted how he saw himself, and nothing loud could have done that. The realization did not arrive all at once. It settled in slowly, like something heavy finding its proper place. Muhammad Ali understood that what had stopped him was not fear or doubt, but recognition. Recognition that some parts of life cannot be outrun, outtalked, or outperformed. That understanding carried a quiet authority he had never felt before. For most of his life, Ali believed greatness had to be declared. You spoke it into existence, defended it with confidence, and proved it with action. That belief had carried him to heights few ever reached. Yet now he saw that greatness could also exist without announcement. It could live quietly, without witnesses. The realization shifted how he viewed strength itself. Strength was no longer just the ability to impose will or dominate a moment. It was the ability to sit with truth without needing to reshape it. That form of strength required patience, something he had rarely practiced in public. He understood that silence had revealed what noise had hidden. Noise rewarded reaction, attention, and performance. Silence offered clarity. In those minutes, he saw how often he had relied on momentum to define himself. Momentum had always felt like control. What changed was his relationship with identity. For decades, his name had carried expectation. People expected confidence, defiance, certainty. In that silence, he realized identity didn't remember him only for what he said or did, but for how he carried himself when those things faded. He saw that time was not an enemy to be defeated. It was a constant companion, moving at its own pace. Fighting it had cost him energy he could never recover. Accepting it allowed something else to surface calm. The realization reframed his past without rewriting it. He didn't regret the fights or the words that made him famous, but he saw them as chapters, not definitions. Life was larger than any single role he had played. No matter how legendary, he recognized that wisdom often arrives late, not as punishment, but as perspective. What once felt urgent now felt distant. What once demanded response now invited understanding. That shift did not weaken him. It steadied him. Ali understood that silence had protected him in that moment. Any response would have been shaped by habit. Silence allowed honesty to exist without distortion. It gave him the rare chance to hear himself clearly. He realized how rarely he had allowed space for uncertainty. Certainty had been his public armor. Yet uncertainty, when acknowledged, did not diminish him. It made him human, and that humanity felt grounding rather than threatening. The realization also carried humility. Not the kind that lowers the head, but the kind that opens the mind. He saw that being remembered did not require constant proof. Presence alone could carry meaning. He thought about how many times he had filled silence simply because he could. Talking had been a way to lead, to entertain, to protect. Now he understood that restraint could lead just as powerfully. Silence could command respect without demanding it. This moment taught him that acceptance did not mean surrender. It meant clarity. It meant understanding where effort still mattered and where it no longer needed to be spent. That distinction changed how he measured himself. He realized that influence could exist without assertion, that people watched not only what he said, but how he handled moments when he said nothing. That awareness reshaped his sense of responsibility. The realization softened his relationship with the past. Memories no longer demanded judgment. They simply existed as part of a larger story. He did not need to correct them or defend them anymore. He understood that this moment would not be remembered for drama, but for depth. It was quiet, but it reached further than any declaration ever had. It reshaped something internal that could not be reversed. The silence had created space for maturity to surface naturally. There was no announcement, no gesture, just a subtle shift in how he carried himself afterward. That shift mattered more than explanation. He recognized that life eventually asks questions that cannot be answered with performance. Those questions require presence instead. In that realization, he found peace rather than resistance. The moment marked a turning point not because of what happened externally, but because of what settled internally. He no longer needed to be the loudest voice in the room. That realization felt liberating. He saw that legacy was shaped as much by restraint as by action, by moments when power was held back rather than displayed. That understanding gave new meaning to everything he had done before. When the realization fully settled, it did not demand change overnight. It simply adjusted his perspective. From that point on, silence would no longer feel like absence. It would feel like understanding,